So I think that's what makes these pictures so fascinating and so interesting, is that for a lot of us that we're doomed to miss out on this sort of thing. It allows us to get as close as we possibly can to seeing what it would have looked like, especially as the map of New England shrinks railroad-wise. The amount of places you can go out with a camera today and see trains operating is shrinking and has been shrinking for the last 60 years. And I think that's important because ultimately it allows us to connect a little bit more to what would have happened and gives these pictures just a little bit more importance.
Hi friends, my name is Steve Guerrero and I'm the Director of Education here at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. I'm really excited to have you here and I'm excited for tonight's speaker. So Waltham has a long and pedigreed history with railroads, I think you'll agree. I'm going to bring on Rick, who is the president of the B&M Railroad Historical Society and is probably the most knowledgeable person I know about this particular topic. And like I said, his earlier talk about Waltham's railroad history is available on our YouTube page back from the fall. And now, tonight, we're going to hear about the end of the Central Mass Line. Without further ado, welcome Rick.
Thank you, Steve, and I want to thank the museum for having me back to talk a little bit more about the railroads of this area in Massachusetts. When we were here last, we discussed sort of the broad history of the railroads in the Waltham area. The three distinctive railroad lines that serve the community, the Fitchburg Maine line, which still is in use today by the MBTA, and the two branch lines which sort of parted from Waltham into different directions. The Watertown branch, which later became known as the Bemis branch, and the Central Mass branch. A lot of people who have an interest or fascination in the railroad, and particularly the Boston and Maine Railroad, have a favorite branch line or a favorite railroad line. I'm from New Hampshire, so a lot of my favorite interests up there kind of align more with the New Hampshire side of things, but the Central Mass branch is probably one of the more famous and beloved branch lines of the Boston and Maine. It certainly was one of the more interesting and one of the longer lines that the Boston and Maine operated. Had a bit of a troubled and interesting history, especially in its first few decades, and saw a heck of a lot of interesting history, particularly in more recent times. One of the really cool things, too, about the Boston and Maine Railroad is that the Boston and Maine kind of came about as the result of aggressive competition and aggressive merging. The railroad map of New England from the 1830s to about the 1880s was a patchwork of different companies, distinctive companies that fought each other and competed for territory and customers as the industrial landscape of New England started to spring up and become the powerhouse that it would be by the 1900s. Of course, all of this competition and all of this infighting had an expiration date, and smaller companies have ended up going by the wayside and being bought out and swallowed up into large railroad systems. So the Central Mass branch, we'll talk a little bit of prehistory here. Tonight we're going to focus primarily from the 1950s to the 1980s, but we'll go back much further to give you a little bit of idea of what the Central Mass line was, how it started, and how it became what we're going to be looking at later in the presentation. In the late 1860s, so about 30 years after the building of railroads really starts to take place in New England, the towns of Sudbury, Wayland, and Weston petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts to build a railroad through their towns. During this period of time, a lot of people, especially in rural locations further out from city centers, were really pining for railroad activity. It became clear that if a railroad passed through your town, your railroad would probably be more likely to be a prosperous location than if the railroad bypassed or just failed to go through your area at all. And if you look at a map of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, you can definitely tell the communities that had railroad access became more prosperous, not only for transportation, but also for travel, tourism, and a whole variety of other things. And so on February 21st, 1868, the state chartered the Wayland and Sudbury Branch Railroad. Now this was an interesting way of going about this. A lot of times when you had railroad construction and charters in the early years, they would charter a railroad from one town to another, a very short period of distance. Eventually, the desire to go beyond that distance would come through when other towns would also voice a desire to have the railroad go through their towns as well. And so shortly after this happened, another group petitioned for an extension to Northampton. On May 10th, 1869, the General Court of Massachusetts chartered the Massachusetts Central Railroad and united that with the Wayland and Sudbury Railroad, which they had previously incorporated, and basically creating the Massachusetts Central Railroad, which would stretch from the Cambridge area all the way to Northampton, Massachusetts, organized on September 2nd, 1869. So we're looking at a distance of about 100 miles of construction from the Boston area to the Connecticut River Valley. Construction began shortly thereafter in 1870, but it actually stagnated for 2 decades, if you can believe that. The route from Cambridge to Hudson was complete by August 20th, 1881, about 14 miles of distance. The line reached Jefferson, Massachusetts by 1882, but then bankruptcy loomed for the Massachusetts Central Railroad, and operations ceased entirely in 1883. With the Massachusetts Central Railroad struggling, the Boston and Lowell Railroad, which was one of the corporate juggernauts of railroad building and operation in this part of Massachusetts, leased the Central Massachusetts on December 7th, 1886, and finally construction resumed out to Northampton again. As though things weren't complicated enough, the Boston and Lowell was leased by the Boston and Maine Railroad on April 1st, 1887, renaming the line from the Massachusetts Central Railroad to the Central Massachusetts branch of the Boston and Maine. The tracks reached Ware, Massachusetts, in the area that we would now identify around the Quabbin Reservoir in June 27th, 1887. And before the end of that year, construction finally finished with the completion of the bridge over the Connecticut River into Northampton. 17 years after construction began, the Central Mass line was finally complete. And so the Boston and Maine Railroad, which would become the powerhouse of railroad operations in northern New England, became the most famous and longest operator of the Central Mass line. And so we're going to start looking at a photographic analysis of what the Central Mass line would have looked like during this time period as the 1920s turns into the 1930s and the Boston and Maine fully strengthens their control of the Central Mass line. Passenger service on the Central Mass branch was provided primarily with steam-powered locomotives for most of its history, although by the time the 1930s come on the scene, the Boston and Maine is starting to replace some of its long-distance steam-powered trains with a new gas-powered rail car. These were sometimes called doodlebugs for the slow and plodding pace that they went down the tracks. And so these doodlebug rail cars were used on the Central Mass branch from the 1930s onwards. The Central Mass branch probably prospered the most between the 1910s and 1920s, but by the time the 1930s came around, things had started to get difficult for the railroad, and having a line of that distance and going from Boston to Northampton was difficult for the railroad to maintain and operate. Sparse population along most of the line, especially around the Ware area. It gets very rural out towards Bondsville and Ware, and so there wasn't a whole lot of passenger traffic that far west. Some of the stations that we'll see here on the line, starting from the east and heading westward, Waltham Highlands Station on the Central Mass branch, taken in 1940. This view is looking eastbound back towards Boston. Following that, Waltham North Station on the Central Mass branch, which is also in the city of Waltham, of course, 1940. This east, also looking eastbound back towards Boston. Cherry Brook Station, which was located in Weston, was another station heading westbound on the Central Mass branch. 1940, Albert Hale ventured out onto the Central Mass branch and took pictures of various stations and locations trying to document the line. It's really interesting too, some of these stations you'll notice have interesting names like Cherry Brook, but it's in the town of Weston. There's a reason for this. Around about 1911, there was a very serious wreck on the Boston and Maine in New Hampshire. A lot of stations that had compass directions in their name, like West Lebanon, Lebanon, East Lebanon, things like that, would get confusing for train dispatching, and that miscommunication with orders could lead to wrecks. And it happened in the early 1900s, where some miscommunication about the names of stations resulted in a serious wreck on the Boston and Maine. As a result, the railroad decided to rename a number of their stations from things that had compass directions in the name to things that were a little bit different. So, for example, Cherry Brook Station refers to the specific location of Weston without getting confusing and possibly causing some misinformation. Wayland, of course, heading west. Wayland is one of the more noteworthy locations on the Central Mass, also one of the more photographed locations on the line. Here again, Al Hale's trip in 1940, photographing the branch. And possibly the most grand station west of Waltham was South Sudbury. South Sudbury is a very fascinating location, and we'll see South Sudbury pop up a lot in this presentation. One of the reasons that it was so remarkable is because it was the crossing point of two distinctive railroad lines, and you can see that right here in the foreground of the picture. The line that we're looking down is the Central Mass branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad looking back towards Cambridge and Boston, and the line that bisects that from left to right is, at this point in time, the New Haven Railroad's Framingham and Lowell line, which of course connected those two cities. Originally part of the Old Colony Railroad system, and by the 1900s was firmly part of the New Haven Railroad system. Fascinating station located at the corner of these two intersecting lines. A lot of traffic, a lot of activity in South Sudbury. And it's just neat to see too, a lot of these pictures have those old advertisements on the side of the station you would have seen very commonly in the 1930s and 1940s. Not every station on the Central Mass branch was as grand as South Sudbury. As a matter of fact, a lot of stations were what you would call a wide place in the tracks, little more than a passenger shelter located at a railroad crossing, perhaps out in the middle of the woods or somewhere where people did need to get on and off the train, but there wasn't enough people to justify a large station. Ordway Station in Hudson, Massachusetts, looking back towards Boston, about 1940. Ordway is interesting. Ordway, at this point in time, 1940, was a pretty barren and isolated spot, but in just a couple of years it would become extremely important because the government would build an ammunition depot at Ordway in Hudson, and once the United States entered World War II, that area particularly became very busy and put quite a strain on traffic on the Central Mass branch. Hudson, a little bit more of an ornate station building in Hudson, 1940, looking westbound. The water tank you can see in the distance would have been obviously used to water steam locomotives heading out on the branch. And South Bolton. This is a great shot. I love the advertisements, Bromo Seltzer. It's just so interesting to see that kind of trademark image of the railroad stations. Railroad stations, particularly in small towns, were the hive of activity. Not only would you get on the train to go to a city or go to a different location, but it's where a lot of meetings happened, a lot of social gatherings. Various railroad stations had grocery stores and barbers located within them, so you could go down to the railroad station and do other business rather than just railroad business. I don't believe that was the case at South Bolton, but a lot of places had those services available. And so you can tell the advertisements are definitely helping to get the outside world into some of these smaller locations. And Berlin on the Central Mass branch in 1940. So this is about as far as we'll go out on the branch, because in later years, this is as far as the branch went. But we'll venture just a little bit further with these earlier shots because there's a pretty interesting location we're going to want to touch on, and that's Clinton, Massachusetts. Clinton, for most of the Central Mass's period during our discussion today, was the western end of the Central Mass branch. Of course, the branch did go further earlier than that, went all the way to Northampton, but by 1940, the Central Mass branch had been abandoned for most of its segment between Clinton and Wheelwright, Massachusetts. And so a big section in the middle was taken out of service and abandoned. And so Clinton is just about as far west as we're going to travel for our presentation today. Clinton was noteworthy for a number of things, particularly the trestle and tunnel that were located there. This was the result of a large relocation project done around 1902 when the reservoir was put in, the Wachusett Reservoir. The Central Mass branch had to be relocated because of the reservoir construction, and so this trestle and tunnel were part of that reconstruction effort. Kind of a cool shot here. This is seen from the rear of a passenger train, a Railroad Enthusiasts Division passenger excursion on the Central Mass branch, which took place April 25th, 1948. So we hinted a little bit earlier at there were troubles brewing on the Central Mass branch as early as 1928. The line, of course, as we said, was finished in the late 1880s. By 1928, no freights and only one passenger train was running the full length of the line from Boston to Northampton. Also, kind of an interesting aside here, Calvin Coolidge, when he was in the Massachusetts government and was traveling from the Northampton area to Boston, would take the Central Mass to get to and from the city. But by 1928, there was only one through passenger train running the whole length of the line. Parallel segments where the Central Mass branch paralleled other railroad companies in Western Mass were abandoned in 1941, and the Boston and Maine went to those other railroads and asked for permission to operate on their trackage rather than having their own line that they were maintaining paralleling these other companies. And so that was granted by the government to abandon those sections that were unnecessary, and that happened in 1941. And so by the early 1940s, the Central Mass branch, as we said, was basically cut into two parts. The Wheelwright branch from Northampton to Wheelwright, which is located just east of Ware, and the Central Mass branch, which kept its name, from Clinton to Boston. Passenger service from Boston all the way to Northampton was canceled on April 23rd, 1932. And on January 30th, 1939, the Boston and Maine formally submitted a request to the Interstate Commerce Commission to abandon that section between Oakdale and Barry Junction. World War II obviously comes around in late 1941, and at that time, operations on the Central Mass branch from Clinton to Boston were 4 daily passenger trains and a daily except Sunday freight train from Mystic to Clinton Junction. And as we said earlier, the construction of that U.S. Army depot at Ordway really helped bolster the Central Mass's traffic during World War II. Into the 1950s, the Central Mass branch is still being used from Clinton to Boston for passenger and freight service. Passenger service usually included a small steam locomotive of the Mogul type, wheel arrangement 260, and usually a couple passenger coaches. And so we see one of those passenger trains on the Clinton Viaduct, October 8th, 1954. One of the things that made the Central Mass so special and so sought after for photographers was the late use of steam locomotives on the Central Mass branch. The Boston and Maine started phasing out steam locomotives on its railroad right about the end of World War II in various locations. But the Central Mass branch was a holdout and actually saw steam use until 1956, which was the last year that steam locomotives were used on the Boston and Maine. The book, The Central Mass, which was published by the Boston and Maine Historical Society, has some interesting passages about the end of steam, and so I'll read a couple of those. By the mid-1950s, several forces both within and outside the railroad were to result in further changes and additional cutbacks. In the spring of 1956, the last steam-powered trains on the entire Boston and Maine system were the 3 early morning and evening passenger runs from Clinton to Boston and return. Later in April, the word was out that any day the steam would come off. On the morning of May 5th, the engine crew of train 3106 sensed that they were making a historic run when they departed from Clinton. When the train passed through Drawbridge 1 in Boston, the fireman, in a symbolic gesture, threw his coal scoop into the water below. Within the hour, the fire was dropped at the new engine terminal and the steam era came to an end on the Boston and Maine. With diesel locomotives now in complete charge, the change at Clinton was, or the engine terminal rather, at Clinton, and the change was closed shortly thereafter. One run was cut back to Hudson, deadheading out in the morning and back in the evening, while the other runs deadheaded from Clinton to Middlesex Terminal in Lowell via Ayr and the Stony Brook branch. The Boston and Maine started having troubles of its own in general after World War II. The rise of personal automobiles, buildings of state and federal highways, improving of local roads, and also the shift away from public transportation by not only everyday citizens, but also shipping and freight companies really started to hurt the railroad in the post-war years. And so you start to see the Boston and Maine cutting back passenger service in a large way, and you start to see freight train counts on a lot of these lines start to shrink. You could probably guess that in the 1940s and 1950s, freight train on the Central Mass branch might have averaged maybe 20 or so freight cars, possibly more than that. It was never a heavy haul freight route, so you wouldn't have seen freight trains of 50, 60, 70 freight cars going down the Central Mass, but about 20 to 40 cars maybe in the period directly after World War II. By the 1960s, you're not seeing any more than 10 freight cars on a freight train, and into the 1970s, possibly 2 or 3. So that shift and that decline happens very quickly. Beautiful black and white shot. Al Hale, who was the one that took all those station shots in 1940 that we saw earlier, continued to follow the Central Mass branch, and so that's a name that you'll see come up right to the very end of train operations on the branch. April 17, 1956, steam-powered commuter train from Boston crossing the reservoir at Clinton. And this is a great shot just to emphasize how tall that bridge was. It was one of the taller bridges on the Boston and Maine system. We have that Railfan excursion that we saw earlier, April 25th, 1948, crossing with some photographers down below getting shots of the train as it crosses over the reservoir. And this is a cool shot too. This is the rear of that passenger excursion with the classic placard. The Railroad Enthusiasts was incorporated in the early 1930s as one of the very first gatherings of railroad enthusiasts to go out and ride railroads and take pictures of them. And they charted a bunch of passenger excursions, and you'll see a couple more in this presentation. Just beyond the trestle and the tunnel, there was a stone arch bridge on the property of the reservoir, and so this is that same excursion in 1948, crossing that bridge there. And the engine house at Clinton, which was as far as most trains went in the period after 1940. The engine house was actually located on a different line that connected with the Central Mass branch, but was used by steam engines that were operating passenger trains out to Clinton. So diesel locomotives, from this point forward, will be the primary motive power that you'll be seeing in a lot of these photographs. This particular shot was taken May 11th, 1956, so right around the same time that steam operations ended on the Central Mass branch, here at the Cherrybrook Station in Weston. Another thing to keep in mind as these photos progress, in the 1950s, the manicured right-of-way here is still looking pretty good, clear of weeds, clear of brush, but as the railroad starts to progress through the 60s and 70s, you're going to see a lot of that change too. And a nice color photo out at South Sudbury, around about the same time, 1956. You can see that crossing of the New Haven and the Boston and Maine there at South Sudbury. That little station building you can see there in the background was the replacement for the grand South Sudbury station that we saw earlier. And so in the 50s, that massive station we saw earlier was replaced with this little structure, which is still there today, believe it or not. But that also illustrates the shift away from passenger train travel and the necessity for smaller structures and buildings. You didn't need a massive station anymore with one passenger car train that was running back to Boston. Freight service on the branch in the 1950s. A number of freight customers, some of them are listed here: Weston, Wayland, South Sudbury, Hudson, and Berlin. Big traffic on the branch, lumber products. Lots of these towns had lumber yards and lumber dealers that did service with the railroad. Another important one was Victory Plastics in Hudson. Plastic to Hudson was one of the very last freight customers in the 1970s. So you can kind of see some of the different traffic that would have been running on the branch in the 1950s. Raytheon, too, in Wayland, another identifiable name that's still around today. Cutbacks continue on the Central Mass branch. 1958 is a big date. This is when passenger service was cut back from Clinton to Berlin, and the tracks between those two locations were removed in fall 1958. And so Berlin is now the farthest west you can go on the Central Mass branch. June 14th, 1959, passenger service is cut back again from Berlin to Hudson. And then January 15th, 1965, service is cut back yet again from Hudson to South Sudbury. Although freight service would continue all the way out to Berlin as late as the 1970s. That'll bring us up into the 1960s. The 1960s is a period of great change and transition for the Boston and Maine Railroad, starting in about 1956 when a new president, Patrick McGinnis, comes into the Boston and Maine. McGinnis is a controversial figure. Many people see him as one of the death knells for the Boston and Maine Railroad. He did do a lot of modernization efforts, but he also cut back a lot on passenger service and did a lot of things that really gave the railroad a bad reputation, including some selling of equipment that caused him to do a brief jail sentence. 1961, 1962, McGinnis is out as president, but all the presidents that come after him in the 60s are not capable either, and so the Boston and Maine is suffering, cutting back their passenger service throughout the 60s, with freight service also suffering in the 60s due to the shift away from railroad freight towards tractor trailers and trucking, a lot of manufacturing companies closing down. And so the 1960s is a difficult decade for sure for the Boston and Maine. We start out October 2nd, 1960 at the Diamond Crossing in South Sudbury. Of course, the crossing with the New Havens, Framingham, and Lowell. This was another fan trip over the Central Mass branch that ran the full length of the line from Boston to Berlin at that little tiny South Sudbury station there. And a good look at freight service in the 1960s. This is February 21st, 1968. Typical freight B43 on the Central Mass branch. B43 was the freight designation that operated the Central Mass. 3 freight cars on this day going 14 miles out the branch. So a lot of distance to cover, paying 5 employees union wages, operating freight service 14 miles at slow speeds. The railroad certainly wasn't making a ton of money operating these prospects. Motive power on the branch was usually either a end cab switcher locomotive, or an EMD GP series locomotive. This is a GP7. GP stands for general purpose. These locomotives started out in passenger service on the Boston and Maine and eventually were transferred into freight service. So here at Hudson in the 1960s, typical freight going out to Hudson with probably a hopper of plastic pellets. The interesting crossing signal you can see there, it was called a wigwag. There's a couple more pictures of these crossing signals in the presentation, but what made them interesting was the fact that they had an arm here that swung back and forth in a wigwag motion. You can't really see the paddle because it's obscured by the bracket there, but there were several of these on the Central Mass branch, particularly in Hudson, and so you can see one of them here. The Boston and Maine usually reserved their newer and heavier locomotives for their mainline trains, but that didn't mean they didn't make it out onto the branch lines. And so we have a GP18, which would have been delivered in 1960, here on the Boston and Maine, heading out on the Central Mass branch, 1968. This is the bridge that crosses over the Fitchburg Division main line, which is down below. I believe this bridge just had decking installed on it for the rail trail not too long ago. So they left it in place, which is nice. Again, I mentioned earlier the appearance of the right-of-way and the track as the 1960s progresses. The 1960s are difficult for the Boston and Maine's maintenance of way facilities as well. Maintaining track conditions, keeping grass and brush short, not a priority as the railroad is losing money. And so you can kind of start to see that creep in here. Weston Station, still standing today, not in great condition, unfortunately, but looking a little bit better here in 1969 as B43 heads out on the branch. Here they are a little bit further around Tower Hill. And heading away from the camera. Those large high-tension wires that you can see parallel the Central Mass branch for most of its length from the Waltham area west, so you'll see a lot of pictures of those towers showing up in the presentation. Into the 1970s. The 1970s was probably the next biggest decade for the Central Mass branch from the 1950s in terms of changes and transitions. The 1950s saw the shift away from steam-powered trains on the branch. The 1970s would see a number of shifts on the Central Mass. Starting off in 1971 with the end of all passenger service on the branch altogether. The end of passenger operations on the Central Mass is an interesting story, and it's partially outlined here in the Central Mass book. And so we'll talk a little bit about what happened to the passenger trains that would have run through these communities. But by the 1970s, the Boston and Maine is operating the world's largest fleet of what were known as Budd Rail Diesel Cars, or RDCs. They started purchasing these in the 1950s to replace conventional passenger coaches and locomotives. Basically what the RDC is a self-propelled passenger car. So it's a passenger car with an engine underneath and a control section at either end. And so you have all your eggs in one basket. Instead of having to pull passenger coaches with a locomotive, you can just run your passenger car by itself. You could also couple together as many RDCs as you needed. And so if your passenger traffic is only calling for one car, you only need to take one car, but you could put 2, 3, 4, as many as you needed together. Budd self-propelled railcars were introduced to the line in the late 1950s in an effort to retain what little passenger business remained. But even that measure only delayed the inevitable curtailment of all commuter service. Cutbacks continued. With the advent of the timetable of May 18, 1958, the number of round trips was reduced to 2 daily, except Saturday and Sunday. On June 14, 1959, a further reduction to 1 round trip was made, and on January 15, 1965, service was cut back to South Sudbury. By the spring of 1969, what few commuters remained, drawn to the train by a remarkable sense of loyalty, could be comfortably handled by 1 Budd car, so the solitary trip was reduced to a single Budd. The Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority obviously felt that it could no longer justify providing transportation for a mere 70-odd passengers per day and recommended that the train be dropped. Last-minute reprieves resulting from political pressure saved the day. The financial drain continued throughout 1969, 1970, and into the summer of 1971. Service reliability reached a new low during the winter of 1970 and 71, when the train didn't run at all on 3 consecutive Mondays because the Budd had frozen up over the weekend. July 30th, 1971 was said to have been the date for the final run. The annual state subsidy was renewed, but without Central Mass branch funding. However, local citizens opposed the move, and their opposition escalated. Meetings were held, ad hoc committees were formed, pressure was brought to bear on the various state representatives of the communities involved, and at the very last moment, the MBTA's advisory board capitulated. They announced that service would continue until further studies could be made. For a while, it appeared that these efforts would not be in vain. Late in September, it was announced that a new schedule would take effect on October 1st, 1971, and that no less than 4 daily round trips would be available to attract the hoped-for avalanche of commuters. 1 morning and 3 late afternoon trips westbound and 3 early morning and 1 evening run inbound were provided to entice the riders out of their automobiles. In the end, it didn't work. On November 26th, the single Budd car comprising train 743 arrived in South Sudbury at 7:13 p.m. It immediately coupled up to the Budd of train 745, which had preceded it out, and together they deadheaded back to Boston. 90 years of passenger service had come to an end on the Central Mass. And so we see that commuter train here in South Sudbury in 1971 laying over just beyond the station for the morning departure. So the train would come into Boston in the evening with the commuters coming back from work, lay over in South Sudbury, and then the next morning depart back for Boston. And you can see the New Haven line crossing the Boston and Maine in the foreground. Interesting shot here at South Sudbury of some commuters getting on the train. As you can see, not a high volume of passengers. The single Budd RDC was all that was required. This is the notice from the Boston and Maine as directed by the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. All passenger train service is discontinued after scheduled trips of Friday, November 26, 1971, at all stations on the South Sudbury line as listed: Waltham, Waltham Highlands, Weston, Cherrybrook, Tower Hill, Wayland, East Sudbury, and South Sudbury. That community effort to try to come forward and save their passenger train was posted on the stations of the Central Mass, October being Try the Train month with new increased schedule, trying to save that passenger service into the city of Boston. But unfortunately, it didn't work. Here we have a Budd car coming back from South Sudbury at Wayland, and another fascinating shot of some of that community involvement there at Wayland Station. This is looking east from the station. You can see the freight house there on the left. We just received at the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society a massive donation of slides, 35mm slides, that were taken by a gentleman by the name of J. Leonard Batchelder, who passed away recently. He took pictures on the Boston and Maine and other places from 1959 right up until about 10 or so years ago. About 100,000 slides in this collection, and we're slowly working through it and looking through it. But last night, when I was at the storage facility identifying some of the slides, I came across a box of slides of that very last passenger train on the Central Mass branch, November 26, 1971. And so these were scanned last night and dropped into the presentation. But it just goes to show the very end of service for passengers out of Boston to some of these communities. This is North Station, of course, single Bud car. Out at South Sudbury, November 26, 1971, this is the morning commuter train getting ready to head back into Boston. There again, we see that board of notices there on the South Sudbury station. For whatever reason, they didn't board at the station itself. I'm not sure if the Boston and Maine still owned that structure in 1971, but it looks like the passengers are actually boarding on the far side of the crossing there at South Sudbury. And at Wayland on a snowbound day in November. It's probably the best shot of the bunch. RDC getting ready to head out of Wayland, passengers boarding. And as the train heads away on a pretty slow and plodding trip back into Boston. Then the evening trip back from Boston, there was only one trip in either direction, so 2 trips total every day, 1 inbound, 1 outbound. This is the outbound, returning from Boston to South Sudbury, Waltham Highlands, heading away. Bud car 6214 was the particular Bud car that was used on the very last trip from Boston to South Sudbury at night. And there it is, after making the final trip, laying over, and then, as we said, the next morning would be coupled together with the other Bud car and run back to Boston, and that was it for regularly scheduled passenger trains on the Central Mass branch. An interesting bit of information about this particular Bud car. For many years outside the Boston Engine Terminal in East Somerville, there were 2 derelict Bud RDCs. If you rode the Orange Line into Boston, you might have gone right past them and seen them there, covered in graffiti, all messed up. One of those 2 cars was the 6214, which powered the very last passenger train on the Central Mass branch. The other was the 6213. They had been kept by the MBTA and used for various purposes and then parked on a side track there in East Somerville. About 2 years ago, somebody set fire to the 2 coaches. This is the 6214, as it was a couple of years ago. Its trucks had been removed, replaced with just regular railroad trucks to roll on, so it didn't have its powered trucks anymore. Yeah, freight trucks. Kind of a mess for sure. But you could still see the Boston and Maine lettering, and all the RDCs were later acquired by the MBTA and used until the 1980s and 1990s. So it also had the T logo on there too. This is after it was lit on fire. Out of the 2 cars, the 6214 and the 6213, the 6214 was a total loss, unfortunately, which was a bit more of historically important than the other one. The other car was saved and was brought to the MBTA headquarters in North Billerica, and so it possibly might be restored in some regard. Changes continuing on the Central Mass branch throughout the 1970s. Clinton, of course, as we said, service to Clinton had ended in 1958, and the tracks were pulled up in 58, but the Clinton viaduct was still standing over the reservoir, was demolished in 1974. They had removed the section that crossed over the road, and so it was basically just the bridge as it was over the reservoir. And then in 1973, something fascinating happened. Steam locomotives returned to the Central Mass branch after 15, 16 years. This was an interesting situation. There was a steam museum in Bellows Falls, Vermont called Steamtown, USA. It was the brainchild of F. Nelson Blount, who was a millionaire industrialist who spent a lot of his fortune buying up old vintage steam locomotives and creating a museum for people to go and see them. And so in 1973, a wealthy couple chartered a train from Steamtown to operate a wedding excursion from Boston to Hudson on the Central Mass branch. And so this wedding train, which shows up in many photographs from this time period, was the last gasp of steam locomotives on the Central Mass branch, the last time a steam engine ever ran on the branch. And it was quite a popular thing for photographers as well. It was one of the steam engines that powered a lot of Steamtown excursions in New England. There it is at Hudson, on the western end of the line in 1973. Freight service was still happening as far as Berlin at this point in time. The locomotive went from Boston to Hudson, leading the correct end forward, so this end forward, and then had to return tender first because there was no turntable at Hudson, so they couldn't turn the engine around, so they had to pull the train back to Boston tender first. As you can see, quite a lot of people out taking pictures, video, film at that point in time. It's a wedding train at East Sudbury, Massachusetts. And at Wayland, crossing the Boston Post Road, Wayland Station. Down at Weston. And Waltham Islands, right here in the city. Rail trail was just completed through here not too long ago. I believe, though, they did leave the section of track right in front of the station, which is pretty cool. And Clematis Brook in Waltham, which was the place where the Central Mass branch met up with the Fitchburg Main Line, and then the train would have taken the Fitchburg Main Line into Boston. And there it is at North Station. Definitely surprising some commuters going home from work. It's kind of fascinating because since steam locomotives stopped operating on the Boston and Maine in 1956, the very first Budd RDCs and the steam locomotives actually did coexist at North Station for a brief period of time. And so this is kind of a throwback to the way things would have looked maybe 1955, 1956. Of course, the old North Station, the old Boston Garden, that's all gone. The railroad enthusiasts returned to the branch October 13th, 1973. They also operated excursions over other lines in the area on the same day. They ran the Lexington branch to Bedford. I believe they ran the Watertown branch down to Union Market, and they also ran the Central Mass as far as Berlin. And here they are at Wayland. And so passenger trains did return to the Central Mass branch in the form of special excursions, but as far as your regularly scheduled passenger trains out of Boston, that of course ended in 1971. Interesting bit of information here about these slides. These are more of J. Leonard Batchelder's slides, which came from that massive collection. The group that acquired that collection from his estate was actually the Mass Bay Railroad enthusiasts, who were the ones who were chartering these trips back in the 70s. Len Batchelder was a big part of organizing those excursions back in the day, and so the organization acquired his collection, and then they're divvying it up to different owners, and so all the Boston and Maine stuff is coming to us, all the New Haven stuff is going to the New Haven group, and so they're finding suitable homes for all of it. Out at South Sudbury with that excursion trip. And this is Berlin. This is as far west on the Central Mass branch that you could go in the 1970s since 1958 when it was cut back from Clinton. There was a lumber dealer in Berlin, and so there was some freight traffic that was going that far. But by this point in time in the 1970s, freight service on the branch had gone from 3 times a week to once a week to as needed. And so very unusual to see a train in Berlin at all in the 1970s, and even more unusual to see a passenger train. So definitely a special occasion. And the Clinton Viaduct, one last look at that bridge before it was demolished in 1974. A little bit different, of course, than the images we had seen of the steam engines crossing them in the 1950s. And that brings us to the last 7-8 years of freight traffic, train traffic at all on the Central Mass branch, 1973 to 1980. And so we're here at Weston, April 13th, 1977. Freight B43, which is going to run the entire 14 miles of branch to get a single car in Hudson and bring it back. Here they are about a half mile east of Weston. You can see the bridge over the Fitchburg Main Line just in the background. Freight service on the branch was the last presence of train traffic that any of these communities would ever see. And it was an unusual occurrence in the later years, and there's kind of some interesting information in the Central Mass book here about it. The longest remaining segment of the Central Mass in 1975, extending 23 miles from Clematis Brook in Waltham to Berlin, saw freight service slowly dwindle to the point where a one-car freight train became commonplace. The track between Hudson and Berlin was taken out of service in March 1977 due to poor track conditions. Further east, two lumber companies at South Sudbury provided the principal reason for the line's survival. Shipments to the once loyal Lind Air Products Company at East Sudbury declined as deteriorating track conditions increased the potential for disaster from derailments of liquefied gas cars. Freight service was reduced to 3 days a week in 1977 and to as needed shortly thereafter. Motive power was usually a GP7, GP9, and SW9, but on rare occasions a GP40-2 or GP38-2 would be used. For context, the GP38s and GP40s came to the Boston and Maine in 1973 and 1978, respectively. And so that was the brand new power on the Boston and Maine, and yes, they did make it out on the branch. But more commonly, you would see end cab switcher locomotives like this SW9 handling the freight out to Hudson or Berlin. Railroad term for this is a caboose hop, when you have just a locomotive and a caboose heading out on the branch. Very symbolic of freight service on a lot of Boston and Maine branch lines during this time period. A lot of these lines that stayed in service until the late 70s, early 80s were only handling a handful of cars, and a lot of times it was just the locomotive and the caboose that you would see heading out to pick up a freight car somewhere or drop a freight car off. But it is important because this was still the glimpse of railroading that these communities had to offer. Weston, on April 18, 1977, another SW9 pulling train B43. Two cars and a flat car. Looks like there's farm equipment. I believe there was a machinery dealer on the line in Hudson, if I remember correctly. There we go. Now you can see the wigwagging. That's the wigwag signal at Ordway in Hudson on July 18, 1978. That arm swinging out as the train crosses the crossing. 1227, an SW9 model switcher, was a very common sight on the branch, particularly in the later years, and you'll see quite a few photos of that engine, particularly in the next couple slides. Lumber car, probably for South Sudbury, would be my guess. And there they are, Central Massachusetts Junction, which is the point where the Marlborough branch, I believe, left the Central Mass branch. The Marlborough branch hadn't been used since the early 70s. Pretty poor track conditions, as you can see. Boston and Maine went bankrupt in 1970, and so they were battling bankruptcy from 1970 until the late 1970s. So it was very difficult to maintain the rights of way. Weed control, things like that were not a priority for the railroad, and so a lot of times they just operated the tracks looking like this. And South Sudbury, they're about to cross over the New Haven line, which you can see in the foreground. By this point in time, 1978, that would have been Conrail operating that line. New Haven was bought out by, well, absorbed into, rather, Penn Central in 1968, 1969. Penn Central, of course, one of the largest disasters in American history, one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in American history. Penn Central was the merger of the New York Central, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the New Haven Railroad, and it was a lot to handle, and it was not handled very well. And so in 1976, the government stepped in and created Conrail, which became the operator of the old Penn Central system. So long story short, the old New Haven line is now Conrail in the late 1970s. And they were still running as far as Chelmsford from Framingham. And here we have a Penn Central freight. So this is a look at the neighbors that the Boston and Maine dealt with in South Sudbury. This is at the exchanging yard in South Sudbury, 1971. Penn Central Freight LP2, which was Lowell to Providence by way of Framingham. That line particularly was still host to quite a few big freights in the early 1970s. And you can see that right here. Quite a few cars on the Penn Central Freight. This would have gone from Framingham through Sudbury up into West Concord and then Acton through a little shred of Carlisle up into Chelmsford and eventually Lowell. And they're heading back to Framingham. They're about to cross the B&M Central Mass, which would have been right behind us. Mishaps, yeah. There were mishaps on the branch in the later years. Some of it was due to track conditions, derailments because of poor track conditions. This is an interesting photo. This is that SW9 I mentioned earlier, number 1227. This is the old switch into the ammunition depot at Ordway. They came upon the switch and somebody had thrown the switch in the wrong direction. They presumed it was an act of vandalism. And so the locomotive went to the end of track. That spur into the ammunition depot had been removed except for a little bit of it. And so they went right off the end of the spur and nosed into the dirt, and they have a high rail truck here that's hopefully going to help rewrite the engine. You can see too that there was no switch stand left. And so whoever had switched the tracks over had to do it manually with a crowbar. So this was an intentional thing that somebody had done.
No one spiked the switch to prevent that?
I guess not. No. Usually, as the gentleman had said here, when the railroad had a switch they weren't using anymore, they would spike it closed so that nobody could do that. Either they removed the spikes and threw it, or they just never spiked it. I'm not sure. But you can see what happened to the 1227. Yep. Not a good day for the crew of B-43. Another mishap, which happened, I believe, around the same time. This was April 28th, 1976. Okay, March 15th, 1976. South Sudbury. The Boston and Maine freight is crossing the Diamond with the Conrail line, and the Conrail locomotive comes down from Chelmsford and hits the first car on the freight train. Right at the intersection. Knocks the first boxcar right off the tracks. Quite a mess. Yep. June 6, 1978 was when this particular incident happened. Basically what happened was even during this period of declining traffic, the Central Mass could not escape its tradition of wrecks. Most probable was a two-train, two-railroad collision at South Sudbury. With service on both lines reduced to a minimum, the color light home signals protecting the Diamond crossing of the Central Mass and Conrail's Lowell secondary track were removed on December 7th, 1977, and replaced with stop posts. 6 months later, on June 6, 1978, while B&M Extra 1227 was crossing the Diamond, Conrail Extra 9380 South ran past the stop posts and crashed into it. The boxcar behind 1227 was tipped over, and several Conrail employees suffered minor injuries. Yep, so pretty interesting event, and probably one of the more interesting derailments that happened in later years. You can see the freight truck of the boxcar tangled up with the steps of the Conrail locomotive. Another derailment, March 15th, 1976. The westbound local freight had just passed over the Fitchburg Route Bridge when the track structure simply gave way and two cars and the caboose toppled off the side of the embankment. Two crew members in the buggy, that's the B&M nickname for caboose, were shaken up, and a Milwaukee Road boxcar loaded with lumber had to be cut up at the site. You can see the lumber load came right through the roof of the boxcar. It's the rare look at the underside of a caboose. Usually the only other way you can do that is with a model. Yeah, a little bit more detail. Yeah, modelers, get your detail here. Yeah. It's a miracle nobody was seriously hurt here. And those cars stayed there for quite a while. This is the track structure, just totally chewed up as the boxcar tips right over on its top. Real mess. Yeah. And the cars stayed there until the snowfall. I believe the caboose was salvaged, but that boxcar was obviously not, and then the Boston and Maine had a bill to send to the Milwaukee Road for one of their freight cars, which is interesting too. Whenever a derailment or a wreck happens on a railroad, the railroad whose tracks it is has to pay the railroad whose freight cars are destroyed. And so in this case, the Boston and Maine would have to reimburse the Milwaukee Road for that freight car. But the Milwaukee went bankrupt in 1980 anyway, so. A sunset shot, and this is sort of the sunset of the Central Mass branch in this part of Massachusetts at the junction of the Penn Central Framingham and Lowell line in South Sudbury. GP7 type locomotive heading back to Boston with the local freight. Another caboose hop, this one's at Hudson. Local freight B43 crossing Bruce's Pond, heading all the way out to Berlin to pick up an empty car and go back. I mean, it's all overgrown today. You know, no trains either, unfortunately. Get some bicycles, I guess. Yeah, this is another freight. This is a GP9 type locomotive on B43 at Hudson, May of 1973. And another GP9 at Ordway in Hudson. You had to time the photo just right to get that arm swinging out from the wigwag, so it looks like Mr. Ben Crouch really got his skills down here, because a couple of the shots that he has it in the right place. And out at South Sudbury, probably a plastics car for Hudson, if I had to guess. And we will enter the 1980s very briefly as we talk about what happened to the Central Mass branch in the very final days, finally getting into the name of the presentation. Local freight B43 at Weston, January 21st, 1980. 2 cars, a caboose, and I believe that's the 1227 again. Yep, a couple years after its little incident there at South Sudbury. Passing Wayland Station. The really, really cool thing about this photo is that this is the same photographer who took a picture of that station in 1940. If you can remember earlier in the presentation, the black and white shot of Weston with all the advertisements on the side of the building, same person. Exactly 40 years later, getting one of the very last freight trains on the line. Here they are at Wayland, coming up on the big crossing. And yeah, crossing the big crossing there in Wayland. Looks like they dropped that flat car and are proceeding to South Sudbury with a single box car. Oh, nope, they still have the flat car with them. Cool. At South Sudbury, there's those stop posts. That didn't work very well. It looks like the crew has dropped their caboose back beyond the crossing and are going to head over the Diamond crossing with the boxcar. Sudbury Lumber was located right behind us, and so they're going to drop that car into the industry. Nice shot here of South Sudbury, very last years, very last months actually, coming over the Diamond. This point in time, Conrail was still running as far as Chelmsford on the line. And it looks like they've dropped their boxcar in Sudbury Lumber, went back to get the caboose, and they're probably going to go out to Hudson to get a freight car. And there they go off towards Hudson. That's the siding for Sudbury Lumber you can see just beyond the locomotive. The cutbacks continue. The last 5 years of operations on the Central Mass branch. An embargo placed February 7th, 1975 on the branch between Hudson and Berlin on account of track conditions. That lumber company that was located in Berlin decided they would receive their rail shipments at Hudson and then truck the product the rest of the way. June 19th, 1980, the final freight run to Hudson for a carload of plastic pellets, but not the final freight run to Hudson, because the very last time a train ever went to Hudson was August 14th, 1980, when the freight crew decided they wanted to take an impromptu lunchtime run to their favorite restaurant, out to the Bar Lunch restaurant in Hudson. And so a couple photos surfaced on Facebook recently of this happening. The crew told them they didn't want the photos put anywhere because they weren't supposed to be in Hudson on that day. They snuck out there. Yeah, I think 45 years later, it's probably okay to tell that story now. And then October 10th, 1980 was the very final freight movement ever on the Central Mass west of Waltham at South Sudbury. There are those pictures out at Hudson of that very last lunchtime run, as they were posted by David Bonazzoli on Facebook. The really cool thing about these pictures is that locomotive, number 1741, is still around today. It was just acquired by the 470 Railroad Club and brought to North Conway, the Conway Scenic Railroad, and they repainted it in the paint scheme it would have worn when it was delivered to the Boston and Maine. So you can go see that same locomotive that ran the very last time as far west as you could go on the Central Mass. It's very operational. It is gorgeous. October 10th, 1980, this is the very last freight movement of any type west of Waltham at South Sudbury. This is the switch for Sudbury lumber. The diamond crossing with Conrail is just behind us. A boxcar was brought by the Boston and Maine and left on the siding just east of South Sudbury. And so they brought a bucket loader over to drag the freight car to Sudbury lumber. And so here they are dragging the boxcar out of the siding. This is the same siding where the RDC cars would lay over back when passenger service was still happening. Dragging the boxcar across the crossing there at South Sudbury, Union Avenue. And then they will drag it over the Conrail line, as you can see here. And once they're beyond the diamond crossing, the bucket loader will come around to the other end and then shove the boxcar into the siding for Sudbury lumber. And that was it. The car was actually retrieved by Conrail, so the customer shifted from the Boston and Maine to Conrail. And so Conrail would have removed that empty car and brought it down to Framingham. But the Boston and Maine never went any further than Waltham after this point. It did exist, yep. There's a couple aerial pictures you can see, and I have a map in a second I'll show you. Of course, the line to Hudson and Berlin was out of service at this point in time. Yeah, so here's a diagram of how things looked at South Sudbury. So the red is the New Haven, Penn Central, Conrail line. The blue is the Central Mass. And so this siding here is where that boxcar was staged. They dragged it across here and then shoved it into the siding. And there was a connection track between the two lines. And so after 1980, Sudbury lumber was served by Conrail from Framingham. They would use that connection track to spot boxcars at Sudbury lumber. 1982 is when Conrail stops running to West Concord from Sudbury, and so they operate the line from Framingham to South Sudbury until about 1995. The rest of the Central Mass branch still sees rail service as far as Waltham, Waltham Highlands, into the 1990s. This is the Lynn Street overpass. Down at Clematis Brook, where the Central Mass joins up with the Fitchburg Main Line, 1988. Late 1980s, the Boston and Maine is still serving a couple customers in the city itself on the Central Mass branch, but they're not going any further than that. And so these are the very last images of freight service on the Central Mass branch. This is a light engine move. Locomotive only had gone out to spot a car at Waltham North. Track conditions are not looking great. The Boston and Maine was purchased by a company called Guilford Transportation in 1983. And so the Boston and Maine ceased to exist as an independent company after 1983. Guilford later became known as Pan Am Railways, and they were bought out by CSX Transportation a couple years ago. Here's the Conrail local at South Sudbury. As I had said, they were still coming up from Framingham to serve the old B&M customer at South Sudbury, and they did that until about 1995. And there's the Diamond at South Sudbury. We had seen all those pictures from the 50s of the Grand Station there, the pictures throughout the 60s and 70s of freights and passenger trains on the Central Mass branch at the Diamond at South Sudbury. The Diamond stayed in place until 2023. Both lines stayed in place. The rails from Framingham to West Concord were still in place, and the Central Mass branch was still in place all the way out to Hudson, and it's slowly being removed to build rail trails in the next couple years. The Diamond at South Sudbury, as it looked 2 years ago, starting to be encroached by trees and vegetation. The old Sudbury station is still there. The Diamond being removed, as well as the rails on both the old New Haven and the Boston and Maine lines. And there's the Diamond sitting next to the old Central Mass after they removed it. I understand there's a plan to incorporate the old Diamond into the rail trail as sort of an interpretive display. I've heard some people that they'll put it back into the ground where the two lines intersected and, put concrete around it and things. I hope they do that. It's already happening? Excellent, excellent. That is great. That is great. Last look at the Central Mass branch as it was with the old 1227, the late 1970s at Weston making their way out with 3 cars on this day, a little bit better than usual. It's interesting, as I was putting together this presentation and scanning these images, scanning these photos and slides and putting them together, I came to the realization that, for somebody that's interested and passionate about these topics, to see photos like this sort of instills a multi-step emotional response. Your immediate gut reaction when you see a picture like this, if you're passionate about trains and you're of a certain age where you were born after a lot of this stuff happened, sort of the immediate gut reaction you get is sort of a surprised and shocked feeling at seeing something like this and realizing where it's taken and what's happening. And that sort of gives way to an analytical perspective where you roll up your sleeves and do what you do as a historian and try to figure out what's happening. Why do they have so many freight cars? Where are those freight cars going? What are they doing on this day? Based on what's in the background, when would this have been taken if there's no date on it? And then that sort of gives way to the inevitable sort of sadness feeling and almost a disappointing feeling, really. Because what you're seeing is something that comes so close to being relatable. You're not looking at a picture of the 1800s. You're not looking at a picture of the early 1900s. You're looking at a picture that was taken maybe 10, 12, 15 years before you were born, of something that is recognizable, but just alien enough to be far away. And so I think that's what makes these pictures so fascinating and so interesting, is that for a lot of us that we're doomed to miss out on this sort of thing. It allows us to get as close as we possibly can to seeing what it would have looked like, especially as the map of New England shrinks railroad-wise. The amount of places you can go out with a camera today and see trains operating is shrinking and has been shrinking for the last 60 years. And I think that's important because ultimately it allows us to connect a little bit more to what would have happened and gives these pictures just a little bit more importance. And we'll close with a final look at South Sudbury in better years, the old B&M station, steam-powered passenger train heading out to Clinton, proper signaling between the two lines, and one of the nicer color shots that was taken by Donald Robinson. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rick. That was great. You've been so generous with your time. Maybe we'll take a couple of questions. I didn't know if you want to talk a little bit about, I saw on social media, CSX recently gave you a pretty good donation of items. And then maybe a couple of questions.
Sure. Yeah, Steve just alluded to a giant donation that we received. CSX Transportation, as I had mentioned, is the modern-day successor to the Boston and Maine by a couple steps of being removed. And so they gave to us the corporate records that are still at the Boston and Maine headquarters at North Billerica. And the vault contains volumes that go back to the 1830s, handwritten documents, engineering plans, maps, employee records, all kinds of things. It's about 3,000 square feet of material. We're currently working on storage solutions. We're almost completely through getting all of the really at-risk materials into climate-controlled storage. So some of those older documents are totally safe. And thankfully, the MBTA and CSX are going to work with us to store that material until we can analyze what's in it and where it needs to go. So yeah, very exciting. I think there's going to be a lot of mysteries in there that got uncovered.
Awesome. Maybe a couple of questions.
Yep.
Sure.
I'd like to say something.
Sorry.
Nope.
Welcome to you with the mic.
Just a quick question. First, a comment. Love the picture of Waltham North. I actually operate a business on that line, and I love the history in that area. So my first question is there public access to some of these pictures?
Yeah. A good number of them have been scanned from various archives. The Len Batchelder stuff that I showed, the last passenger train, the fan trips, those are in the B&M Historical Society archive, so yeah, those are accessible. Pretty much everything in here was scanned with the permission of the owners, and almost everything is owned by a historical society or association. So yeah, pretty much everything in here is accessible, yep.
I'd just like to mention, you mentioned the people in Boston when they saw the wedding train, how surprised they must have been. On Thursday, March 1st, 1973, I was walking across Waltham Common, coming from school, going to the News Tribune to get my newspapers, and I saw that wedding train come chugging out across Moody Street. It's the only operational steam engine I have ever seen in my life. It was heading into Boston. And another reason I remembered that day, that was also the day the drinking age went down to 18. But anyway, I just wanted to say that.
A lot happened. Very cool.
First of all, Rick, I want to thank you, obviously, for coming out tonight. Another Central Mass fan to another. It's really nice to see that the story of the Central Mass continues on in today's age. One thing I noted, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe service on the Framingham and Lowell up to South Sudbury actually went up to about 2000.
Oh, wow.
CSX actually adopted the service from Conrail, but then one day they dropped a car on the ground and said, that's it, we're out of here.
Yep. No kidding, that's cool. So within our lifetimes, that's neat.
Yeah.
Very cool.
But again, thank you so much for your
Thank
presentation.
you, yeah.
Yes, I think he was first. Then.
Hi. Do you happen to know why it looked like somebody had hung their washing on the front of 1227 in some of those pictures?
Yes, I do. So those switcher models, the large radiator grill in the front, the Boston and Maine would put canvas in front of them to keep moisture and other things from getting inside. So, yep.
Just a couple comments. I worked for Penn Central. I was track supervisor in Boston from 1973 to 75. The Lowell branch was part of my territory. Went over it many times. Also, I rode that RRE excursion that you pictured that went out toward Clinton.
The 73, yep.
Yeah, I was on that train. And I'm just confirming what the other gentleman said. CSX did start operating to South Sudbury in 1999 when they took over. But a year or two later, they derailed a car south of Sudbury, and they decided they weren't going to come back.
And that was it. Very cool, thank you. Good to know. I guess a question over here on the left. Yeah. Oh.
I just wanted to thank you for this presentation. I was a big fan of the Central Mass. I barely remember it, but I do remember it. And about 2014, 2015, my friend John and I, we did a YouTube series called Abandoned Railroads of Massachusetts.
Yep.
And we did it took about 15 episodes to do the entire Central Mass from Alewife to Northampton. So,
Very cool. I'm glad you did, because the rails are gone now, so that's records of what was there.
Oh, yeah.
Good,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, so it was...
Yeah, there's kids in 20 years that are going to look at that and go, oh, there were rails there at one point.
Yeah, so,
You know?
so I just wanted to thank you for this presentation.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Yep.
Hello. Until when were there ticket agents working in the stations on the Central Mass Railroad?
That's a really good question, and it depends on the station. Some of the stations that were discontinued in the 30s, 40s would have had their ticket agents removed. I don't know the exact answer to that. I would guess that towards the end you could probably only buy tickets at North Station, but if anybody knows the correct answer to that, please step in. Towards the end it was all out of North Station? Yep.
All right, I want to thank everybody for coming out and spending some time with us. Thank you, Rick. Please come back to visit the museum. Have a good night.